see you. Glad you came. And lastly, if you're getting what you came here for, please stand up. That should be everybody. Woo! Awesome. So we're going to keep the program moving. I am excited to talk to our next speaker. I asked her before today's conference, what's your most memorable DRJ moment? And by a show of hands, how many of you were here back in the 90s with DRJ? All right, we got some dedicated people here. So she shared a story with me that with the former organization that she worked with, they hosted post-mock disaster exercises that were choreographed with stations and actors who had makeup for an earthquake simulation. You guys remember that? Yes. So I thought that was pretty cool, and I would love to be a part of that if we can fit that into the schedule at a future conference. Great idea. Our next speaker began her career in information technology, supplemented with over 20 years in consulting and consulting management in the fields of IT and its application across the enterprise for process improvement, crisis communication, business continuity, and emergency notifications. For the last 15 years, she has been focused on the notifications industry through senior leadership roles with SunGuard Availability, Mir 3, and now OnSolve. This experience has prepared her for the role of president of OnSolve as a leader in global delivery of critical communications. She gave me one leadership tip that she stands firm by, and that is listen to others and come out of your own mindset. Because we need to listen with the ear to understand other people's perspective. That whole thing ties into leadership. So do me a favor, look at the person to your right and say, I'm about to learn something new. Okay, now look back the other way. And tell them, I'm about to learn something new. So what you need to know about our next speaker is she is not here to pitch a product. You will walk away learning something new. So without further ado, please help me welcome Ann Pickering of OnSolve, managing risks, finding sanity in the uncertainty of today's environment. Ann Pickering.
Thanks, Vanessa. I really appreciate it. All right, we got the mic running yet? Can you guys hear me? That's going to be difficult. All right, it's on now. Sound. I feel like it's. All right, we're going to check out sound one more time. You guys don't understand. Susie and I had a slight problem with what do we do with the reception unit of the lav mic. So they are attached to our body back here. So it's not going to be an easy thing for me to turn it on and off at the moment. So.
Is it on? So mine's on.
It is on? All right, we're ready to rock and roll. Vanessa did a great job of telling a wonderful story of an experience. She asked me, I did not know when she asked yesterday why she wanted to know about my memorable.
Susie's on. And mine on, not yours. We need to switch.
Just go to the podium.
That's not fun.
Contingency.
All right, we're there. Is that better? You know, you didn't want to hear me anyway. All right.
You look great.
All right, so just bring the handheld up and I'll use that. Oh, you can hear me now. Okay, I'll stay close to this and try not to yell a lot. Susie's going to help me. So the memorable experience was really quite a fun thing to do, and it's kind of representative of why DRJ is so special to me. That was in my old Comdisco days, and I had a couple of folks in the front row. John and Marianne looked at me like, what's your memorable experience really going to be? but it really was an interesting one that was then further emphasized by a little hurricane that tried to sweep through and create its havoc as well.
It's on.
It's on? All right, I get to walk around. It works. I can use my bad posture and lean into the podium. So my job here today when Vanessa introduced me was really to give you a few little moments in history, but I really want to present someone in a few moments who has a much better perspective that you will truly enjoy hearing. But foremost, when I think about my role today, and I look back a bit about this industry, I really struggled with what did I want to present about risk? And how did we want to share something that you could walk away and use? So our job really is to introduce you in really a really high level around risk. But when I look at risk today, it comes because I'm actually spending a lot of time with our customers talking about what they're doing with their programs. And it all starts because of the risk that they face. And the interesting part about those risks is that as we look at where we started in our industry, and Vanessa told you how many years back I go. Oh, one interesting thing, I was looking at the slide of polling. If you haven't watched the poll or responded, when I last looked, 50% of you had been in the industry for 10 or more years. So you've seen some of this change already, and if you are new, you're going to see more of it as it progresses. And it's going to move faster, just like we talked earlier. The velocity of what's changing is far more significant than it has ever been for us. And when I look at the core of where we used to focus around natural disasters and you know, data centers going out, we had a laugh at lunch or breakfast this morning about some of the old slides that we used when we talked through with customers about building their IT disaster recovery plan. Is we had a picture that showed tapes coming out of a data center. Do you know what those were? Right? And getting on a truck and going to an off-site facility and then showing when, you know, some disaster hit, how those tapes were picked up, put on a truck, and taken to a data center. Amazing now, isn't it? What we have. So when we started in that core, we now see ourselves coming out much more into operational risk. We have to know so much more about what's hitting us than we've ever had to know before. If you sit in a position that allows you to get access to your executives and possibly your board, you'll hear the topic of risk. I have to address that with our board for OnSolve, and that's one of the things we measure. What are our risks, and what are our you know, what are we going to do about that, and how are we going to deal with it? And it's not the simple risk of, you know, losing one of our facilities or one of our buildings along the way. It's a much different risk that we talk about. And it's got to prepare you to lead that way as well. Executives are talking risk, governance, compliance. They're talking about duty of care. They're talking about those things we've always wanted them to talk about. And now we have to be prepared to help them through that along the way. So really, when we think about what we deal with, these critical events are changing in severity, and they're varying depending on their overall impact to people and assets or facilities that we have in our organization. And it's all types, all sizes. It's not easy to project, and clearly not anything that was what we used to deal with in the past. Maybe we just had blinders on, maybe it was there before, but the fact is now I know that you have to lose sleep over this very topic of what are all the things that are maybe even unknown to me that could in fact impact us. So when we think about risk, I'm going to categorize it, and whether you agree with this definition or not, but it's potential loss or damage to a critical asset because of a threat that exploited a vulnerability that you have, right? So there's something that exploits an area that is a gap that you have in your overall ability to cover your risk. And that's what we'll talk about. We used to talk about when we would do the precursor to a business impact analysis, and we were doing the risk assessment piece. It was very simple. It was typically storms, fires, building access, earthquakes, things of that nature. And now when we think about those things, we couldn't even imagine all the different specific risks that we have when we think about the things that hit our environment today. So they're much different. They're larger in reach, compounded very much by the velocity in which they hit us. Their onset is so immediate now. It's not something that we have a chance to plan for in terms of an approaching risk that's going to develop over time. And often it's both internal, but it can also be some of the external systemic risk within your areas. So if you haven't thought through those, it's also an area of focus for us when we think about that. So as we know, these new developing risks we have lead us to an area that we have almost an unimaginable world that we have to live in around risk. And one of the things that I see every day, as I said, when we talk with customers and how they're mitigating or addressing those is extremely important. I've become a great fan of kind of the bubble chart on the quadrants, and I know there's probably some magic word for it, but when you really think about measuring your risk and you understand, I have known risk, and I also have a readiness to respond to those. And the goal of this is to measure those and understand where you've properly prepared for and are ready to respond to these emerging risks that hit. So no matter what we think we know, we are never going to know everything. We're never going to be able to really know every circumstance of what's going to hit. But more important, our job really is to be ready no matter what that impact is to your organization. So the goal is really to take this chart that says, look, I have an impact and I have a readiness to respond. And what I want to know is I'm moving over to the right side of the chart so that I'm ready to respond, regardless of the impact or the impact of that risk as it exposes and develops for me. So just as we talk today, that is our goal, to make sure that we can share with you some of the understandings of risk and addressing them, acknowledging them, recognizing them in the workplace that you're in, and also knowing how to prepare for those risks and position your companies for success through any of those issues that occur. So you minimize the impact and you maximize the value you are to your organization. So I thought, well, let me think about this. How much do I really want to sit up here and talk for an hour with all of you about risk? And I decided that you probably, putting myself in your shoes, would much rather hear a very dynamic speaker and someone that I call a dear friend in the industry that would give you a perspective that I guarantee you will take you to a new point of thinking about you and your program and your goals and objectives you should have overall. So I'm pleased to ask Suzanne Laughlin from Crisis Risk to come up and join us. Now, you may know, steal her thunder because she's great with her own introduction and probably do a much better job. But as you come up, Susie, one of the things that Susie and I had a chance to work together 10 years ago or so at Firestorm, and I had her with me when we were doing a risk and business impact assessment for an organization. And she sat with me in one of the interviews, and as I would ask a question and they would answer it, her next response was, "How do you know? Are you sure?" And I was like, where's she going with this? How do you know? Are you sure? And that would drill to another question, And I sat back, and she uncovered some amazing components of risk I never thought about through the process. So I gained a great respect in having her along with me and helping identify some of those very key things that are important. So I'm going to step back off stage for a moment. I will say Susie, I call her Susie. So Suzanne, Susie's fine, thank you. Susie joined us at our Unsolved User Conference a couple of years back, and she was on a panel. The responses came back from the panel to say, would you please give her a whole day on your agenda? Well, I'm stingy, I'm not gonna give her a whole day, but I invited her back the next year and gave her an hour. So she was with us last May, and she only took the hour, she didn't take the whole day. And the results of the surveys from the conference came back, and they're like, give her a whole day. So,
putting the pressure on now.
So the pressure is now on, but you will have the chance to experience that as well. Please use questions, and Susie will leave some room for questions. I'll join her back up in case there's something that you might have focused more to me. But between the two of us, we'll answer the questions. But I'm going to give her the stage and give her a chance to kind of change your thoughts a bit about risk in your organization.
Thanks, Ann. And I've learned a ton from Ann. Ann worked with us for a brief period at Firestorm, and truthfully, I had not known a lot about business continuity. My background, I'm a lawyer, and I spent most of my career in the insurance industry. And you know, insurance is about like, how do we put a price tag on risk? How do we quantify in dollars what we might have to pay if something bad happens? But the other side of insurance also is, how do we prevent it in the first instance? And that, I think our industry was a little slow to make that the focus. But business continuity really gave me a whole different perspective on how you go about understanding what's really important in these companies, what are they vulnerable to, how the interrelationships between the business departments themselves can create risk. And I think that's probably something all of you have experienced. So thank you for having me here today. I'm really happy to be here. As Ann said, I am one of the founders of Firestorm. I see, and I was so pleased to see they're a silver sponsor, and there's a couple people who might be in the room. Jason Russell, who's the president of Firestorm, I want to acknowledge, and Cheyenne Marling, who heads People Solutions at Firestorm. Jim Satterfield, my partner in crisis risk, and Jim and I have worked together in the insurance industry for the past 30 years, something like that, the mid-90s. So we're old, and I guess that gives us the ability, though, to bring some perspective to the topic of risk. So today I want to talk about the strategy around risk and how we can think about risk a little differently in a way that makes us a little more strategic in how we view things, and perhaps positions all of you to add value to your leadership teams in your companies, because I frankly think that the days of thinking narrowly about risk, thinking about risk only based on what's happened in the past, is not going to position us well for where we're going in light of the rate of change, as you heard Andrew talk about, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So we lump risk into 3 buckets. So there's risk we know we don't know, meaning we know it's out there, we're not really looking at it, we kind of like, maybe we don't even want to know it's out there for various reasons. And then there's the risk that we know we don't know. So I'm going to delve into each of these 3. So what do we know? I mean, these are things that mainstays of what we focus on historically in business continuity planning, emergency response planning, fire and flood and earthquake, things that are manageable because we understand them, we understand their impacts, we understand what it means to an organization to lose facilities and lose people, lose technology as a result of these types of threats. These threats are different than the type of threats that are what I'll call more systemic in an organization. So we can look at, this year, well, every year really, is fraught with all kinds of interesting events that pose, they become crises for organizations that aren't prepared, and they result from this systemic cultural disconnect with leadership, I'm going to call it. So we could look at the hashtag #MeToo movement. I mean, when was the last time we picked up the paper? I think just last week. Was it the CEO of Sony who just stepped down as a result of a relationship-related issue? We see situations involving discrimination. We see manifestos published on gender issues. And you can look at these countless examples of events that didn't have an underlying type of external threat. Rather, their threat was really something internal. It was something either based on their culture or based on the individuals who oversee those organizations or who look away within those organizations at conduct that's going on. And eventually it surfaces and it has to be dealt with. So I think when we think about the risks that we know we don't know, they fall in a couple of categories for me. One, the risks we don't want to see, they're usually cultural and we just don't want to deal with them. I have an organization we work with that has a very, how do we say this? I won't even be tactful. They have a culture that's founded on bullying. It's really based on bullying. And they've been that way forever. And people just bully each other, they've done that, and it's an organization with thousands of people. So their workplace violence program employs 6, 7, 8, 9 full-time people that are just doing investigations. And you say to yourself, how could that even be possible? But it is. So that's one example. So something systemic in your culture. I think that the known unknowns are technology-based. So yesterday I attended a session that Cheyenne and Hart Brown and Mark, and I'm sorry Mark, your last name is escaping me right now. Go ahead, what is it? Herman? Mark Armour. So they did a session on AI and robots, and Cheyenne talked about the jobs of the future, where that's going. So I think that when we think about technology and we think about AI was, primarily the topic, that falls in that category of known unknown. We really don't know much about it, but I think I'm also going to show you that it also falls in the unknown unknown. The other area of technology we're paying very close attention to are drones. How many of you have thought about drones as it relates to your own risk profile? Anybody? Are some of you in the logistics business, or what types of industries? Just shout out a couple, I'm curious. Telecom? Anything else? Logistics, airlines, insurance, okay. So, drones can mean a lot of really great things. If you're a realtor or a photographer, it's given us the ability to look at home shopping in a whole new way, rather real estate shopping. You can go online and get a virtual tour and you can get the aerials and all that's really cool. I personally am waiting for the day that Amazon starts to bring my packages with a drone, although I've figured out that the dog food bags are going to be super heavy. It's going to be something very big that might need an actual helipad on my property. But we can think of good uses. We can think of things like maybe a drone could be used to bring in an AED machine faster than we can get any other vehicle or person to a site. So there's lots of positive things that drones do and will do. The military's using them for advanced work and as a way to reduce the risk to people in the field. But when we look at any good thing, we also have to look at what could be the downside of that thing? What could go wrong with drones? And what happens if drones get in the wrong hands of the wrong people? So the areas that we're starting to pay attention to are things like corporate espionage. I don't know if you've seen these drones. Some of them are literally like your fingernail. They're tiny, like a mosquito. And those drones could attach themselves to a window, for example, and they could have an audio device, and it could listen in on your next board meeting, or your next, strategy planning session, or your next great idea that you're about to present. So it could be a little tiny thing that flies over someone's home, a celebrity's home, and takes photos. It could be weaponizing drones. Has anyone been paying attention to what that looks like? It's very scary. Just go in Google drone and gun and see what's happening. It's frightening. And you think about ways that, the challenge for the bad guys who want to do harm is how do you get the gun into the facility that you want to go to? Well, drones give people a whole new opportunity. Think prison yards, think schools, think airports. Think about airports where you're walking out. Some airports, people go outside actually after they clear security before they get on a plane. So the whole point is that all of these technological advances require some thought as to how they impact your industry and how they impact the types of plans and things you're going to, put some time into. And I'll tell you, I think also, Ann and I talk about this a lot, that, and it may not be for everyone in the room, but it's my understanding that many of you don't feel that you're viewed strategically by your organizations. And I think you have a real opportunity. I think you gotta change the dialogue. I think you gotta take it up, when you talk risk assessment, it's gotta go beyond these known things that we're doing over and over again. I think you gotta start highlighting threats like drones, threats like culture, and see if you can get some attention. So when you're thinking about your planning, I would try to get the ear of people who are open to allowing you to participate in a process that, call it a brainstorming process. I took some notes when Andrew was talking, because one of the things that some of the proactive, granted larger companies are doing is they are gathering very smart people together, and they're starting to think through the unknown. So really, I'm a little behind. Ann knows this too about me. I'm not very good about remembering to advance my slides. So in this case, the unknown, things that, and by the way, that's a Donald Rumsfeld term. I didn't realize that he had coined that, but the unknown. So that's really what we're talking about now. With the unknowns, these are things that really are way out. I mean, based on what I heard yesterday, I know Mark and another gentleman, they presented some information in part, who talked about Moore's law and the compounding effect of technology and how quickly things are changing. So there's probably absolutely no way that you can predict even maybe 5 years. Certainly not 10, it doesn't sound like. So with that said, though, it doesn't mean you should do nothing. I think you have an opportunity to rally out-of-the-box thinkers in your organizations on a regular basis. Maybe you do it quarterly, even it's twice a year. Just do it at some point, where you start to think about your industries. Think about, where are we headed? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the risks that we think the new technology is presenting? But then you gotta layer on a whole bunch of other things. Maybe it's climate change. Maybe it's political risk. Maybe it's more advances in technology. Maybe it's the changing workforce and the mindset of how people approach work. So you can't just, actually, is Andrew still in the room? I'm not sure, but I learned something from that yes and game that we just did. Because I was thinking about, how could a meeting like that maybe flow? So someone starts off and says, well, maybe I'm a utility. I'm concerned about EMPs, electromagnetic pulses. Anybody planning for electromagnetic pulses? Yeah? Okay, I see a lot of heads nodding. Okay, so someone throws out, I'm concerned about EMP. Yes, and I'm concerned that if we have an EMP, it could take down the power grid. Yes, and if it takes the power grid out for more than a week, it means this to us. Yes, and if that goes out, we lose this. In other words, I found the flow of that in our dialogue. Yes, it got us very far out of where we started, but that's exactly where you want to go. You want to get very far out, because you're really trying to think of the unknowns. Where could this really go? And look, Hollywood's really good at this. Remember the Terminator? I mean, is that now so far-fetched? So if you look at Hollywood, they're great at taking our imaginations to these places. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as people who are professionals in risk, in resilience, in planning, to really think out of the box and try to come up with these ideas and concepts. What you do about it afterwards, you may just attribute some of them and put it in the bucket that says, heck, I mean, there's absolutely nothing we can do about that. I'm not even going to waste time or resources or pay attention. That said, EMPs, for example, they could be natural, is my understanding, or they can be like a terrorist situation, right? We could have a missile in North Korea, right? That someone knows more about this than me, but a little bit that I understand. So I think that that's not so far-fetched. So putting our minds out there, trying to build strategies around that, and at least understanding your exposure today, 5 years from now, it would be a very good exercise for you, for every company. we were talking about, someone mentioned Futurists, I think Andrew did, and maybe somebody else, maybe it was yesterday. So this was an interesting quote I saw that really hit home with me. The next 20 years will see more change than the last 300, and the last 20 will have nothing to do with the next 20. That's a little daunting. One of the takeaways for me here is that when we think about the next 20, we probably shortchange ourselves if we focus on what's already happened as a predictor of what's going to happen. And there's this great podcast I listen to. Has anyone listened to Tim Urban? If you get a chance, go listen to this podcast. It's called, the person who interviewed him named it Grand Theft Life. And he talks about the future, he talks about AI, he talks a lot about Elon Musk. He got to spend a lot of time with him. And he said something in that podcast that gave me some perspective on this statement, you know, what the next 20 years could be like. He said, he called them DPUs was his metric. If you went back in time, if an alien came down and they went back and they found George Washington, you know, in the 1700s, and they brought George Washington into a spaceship, and they flew him into the future, how far would you have to take George Washington into the future before he would die from what he sees? And he named that DPU, Die Progress Unit. And his point was that the DPUs are getting shorter. So think about it. George Washington in the 1700s. Horse, no cars, no electricity. Communications, definitely no on-solve. What was his on-solve? Smoke signals, maybe a letter that someone carried on a horse. Can you imagine if he walked in, even if someone showed him that original picture that Andrew put up of the old computer? I mean, imagine like the concept of electricity and then telephone and then iPhone and then FaceTime, and I mean, maybe he would die. I don't know. I don't know what that point was. Maybe he would have died in the 70s. Maybe he would have died 100 years ago. Who knows? But the takeaway from this podcast was that it's getting shorter, that interval, and the ability to predict is also really getting challenging. So based on that, I think that we could throw our hands up in the air and say, well, the rate of change is so fast we can't possibly stay on top of it. And to some extent, that might be true. But I do think there is something that we can all do, because we know that the outcome of some unexpected event could lead to what? What could it lead to? We're not ready for something. What's your biggest fear when you're not ready for something? Some major disruption for sure, right? And crisis. Typically, when we are unprepared for an event of some magnitude, it will lead to a crisis. So our proposition really is that you should prepare and identify the threats you can, but you should treat crisis as the threat. Because if you treat crisis as the threat, you can do something. And you've done a lot already. There may be more you can do in your programs, but you've done a lot already. So, you know the term, the insurance companies will use the term peril, right? Flood is a peril, fire is a peril. And they'll only cover you if you've had some type of peril. Now, some companies are also actually adding crisis management now to their policies so that if you've had some triggering event, you can get the type of resources you need to help manage the aftermath of that event. So I suggest to you that you view crisis itself as the peril. It changes your mindset. And then it kind of also takes some of the weight off your shoulders as to not being able to predict absolutely everything. So really, let's see, we've got 30 minutes. All right, I don't even know if we'll need all that, but let's go through some of the definitions. I want to talk a bit about crisis, but before we do that, I don't know about you guys, but I've found that words mean different things to different people, and even within your own company, you may find that someone uses the word threat, someone uses the word risk, someone uses crisis, and they mean something completely different, right? Incident, emergency. So whether you agree with the definitions that we have up here, you don't have to. For purposes of what we're talking about, go with it. But what I would suggest to you is that everybody needs to have very clearly defined terminology so that you can get everybody on the same page in your organizations as to what you're talking about. So it all starts here with critical assets. We're trying to protect something, right? What are the most important things we're trying to protect from either a bad actor, from some type of external threat? I mean, we're trying to protect people, brand, reputation. Some of you are how many public companies? We got a bunch of public companies in here, I'd imagine. Shareholder value, I'm sure you've heard about that. Key relationships, supply chains, and business partners and customers. So at the end of the day, these are really your critical assets, and everything you're doing, whether it's for business continuity, crisis management planning, emergency response planning, is about protecting those assets. And the leadership of your organizations, at the end of the day, they're the ones responsible to do that. So I think that we have to understand, I think that was the vision. If I go back and try to put it in context of what Andrew was saying, start with your vision. Your vision is to protect these critical assets. So what's a threat? Simple definition here, a person or thing that can cause harm to a critical asset. So it could be human error, it could be workplace violence, it could be a weather event or a product defect or an outbreak, some type of a communicable illness. Those are all threats. How vulnerable you are to those threats is a direct result of how prepared you are. And this is where I often get into debates with people who will challenge and say, well, we've done everything, and just because we've done everything, you can't, we still are vulnerable. And absolutely, that's true. But the point is, if I own a home in Florida on the beach, and I recognize hurricane's my threat, and I've got hurricane shutters, and I have an evacuation plan for my family, and I have gas in my car, and I do all these things, I'm less vulnerable to hurricane than my neighbor. And that's really all you can do. Does it mean that my house is going to withstand the hurricane? Absolutely not. But my family will, because I'm going to get them out long before the threat has come to my door. So understanding your vulnerability to the threat positions you to put in place those types of plans that you really need that are going to make a difference. So the risk is really a function of, it's the potential for loss or damage to one of your critical assets as a result of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. And that was the definition that Anne had put up there. And it's a real mouthful, but if you break down what every one of those words mean, they're all words that are a part, an equal part almost. So you've got the potential for loss, you've got harm. If no harm to a critical asset was going to happen, is it a really big risk? It's not something we're going to prioritize. But if it involves one of our critical assets, absolutely you're going to prioritize it. And you know what? It would be negligence if you didn't. So, and then of course understanding your vulnerabilities and doing something about it. So the event, we talk about an event, the threat has materials. So now you've had an event. So what's a crisis? An event becomes a crisis when your organization's response fails to prevent severe impacts to critical assets and there's an extensive negative reaction. That's the part I get a lot of pushback on. Many people will say you could have a crisis without this extensive negative reaction. That just the very loss of somebody, the burning of a building, that's a crisis. And I'd argue differently. I would say it's not a crisis. It's absolutely, it could be catastrophic, it could be a disruption. But a crisis, from my perspective, after years, decades of working with entities that have had difficulties, a crisis really occurs when you've had that harm to those critical assets and people feel very negative about why that happened. So bad things can happen, but if you handle yourself in a way that instills confidence and reassures people and maintains trust, you can navigate that very bad event without it becoming a crisis that impacts your core assets. So I understand that, again, this may not be the working definition you'd like to have, and everyone should choose what works for them, but I will tell you in our experience, this really bears out. So let me take you through a tool that you could use to really try to understand it. So when does an event become a crisis? So here we say, consider the ABCs of crisis. Think about emotions. How often do you see in the news, after something's happened, that people say, oh, I'm so angry, or I'm outraged, right? Outrage is a big word in crisis. And there's a man named Peter Sandman who's written prolifically on the topic of outrage as it relates to crisis. So outrage is certainly one of the first words you hear. But then one of my clients recently pointed out, you know, that word's really gotten diluted. Everybody is outraged by everything now. So how do we really use outrage as a metric? So what we found in our experience is that when you have these types of emotional responses like anger, people are angry at what you did, they're blaming you, they're talking about suing you, or they're expressing real concern, they're afraid. Let's take a communicable illness. Let's face it, we're all going to be scared to death. If there's some, avian flu outbreak, we're all going to be scared. All the plans in the world aren't going to take that away, but the companies who had the plans might be, way better, will be well better positioned than those who didn't. So emotion is part of the response when you're thinking about crisis. But you then have to give it context. How broad is it? How many people are outraged? Is Anne the only one outraged? Are all of you outraged? Very different escalation to what's happening. And that's something, by the way, they have to monitor, because that changes. When events first break out and people learn about it, especially cyber, and this is probably the wrong thing to say for someone in my business, but I expect to be hacked at this point. Like, is anyone really surprised when you find out your data was taken? Maybe some of you still are, right? How many of you are not surprised? Just show me your hands. How many of you, same hands, you expect to be hacked? You do. So at this point, I don't think there's a lot of outrage when you hear about a cyber breach. The outrage comes from how the company handled it. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples right out of this, and I think you'll get a feel for what I mean. The speed. How fast does it travel? How quickly does something go viral? Remember the United Airlines situation? Right? That was really fast. And then also the setting. What is the context? Is it like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal reporting on it? Is it maybe a local media outlet that's reporting on it? And of course, the risk always is that gets reshared and it gets picked up. But all of these are ways to look at the event and measure public reaction to them. And that will help you start to feel for, do we have a negative reaction to what occurred in our company? How big is it? How bad is it? And that will help you determine what your next steps are. Because at this point, when you've got these going on, remember whatever already happened from a life safety standpoint, if there was an underlying life safety threat, we're past that now. People have been dealt with medically and all of that. This is now about your reputation. And the things you say and do at this point in the timeline of events is going to make the difference on whether your company gets through it, how much impact will it have financially, will your customers lose confidence in you, will you have lost that trust? So this is a way to think about the aftermath of the event when you're trying to determine how bad a situation do you have on your hands. So here's a few examples that everybody remembers. Johnson & Johnson, right? The Tylenol Scandal. How do we feel about how they handled that? Raise your hand if you think your takeaway is that they did a good job. At the time. Okay, some of you. I think what we could say about that is, at least what I'll say about it, is that what impressed me is that decisions were made with a view toward victims. The company broadened the recall beyond that where they had to go because they didn't want to take a chance, and they wanted to send a message that everybody matters, not just the people in the region where this occurred. They also did something that I think was pretty game-changing, and that was they reset the standard on how medicine is going to be packaged in the future. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's probably still best practice that what they developed, right? With the lock and the paper that you have to pull back and all these ways that you can determine whether or not someone's been in your bottle. So I think they really transformed their situation into something that enhanced their brand. Coal miners in Chile. Do you guys remember the mining accident? By the way, that's wrong. I inverted two numbers. There were 33 miners trapped for 69 days. And what was very positive about this was that you had the Minister of Mining, who had been new to the job, and he decided he was going to go on site. But what he recognized was something important for any crisis. When you go on site and you show up, you're going to be held accountable. So you have to be willing to be accountable. He did that. He also did something else. He thought about those families from the perspective of if it were his family. And he said, I'm going to communicate with these people the way I want someone to communicate with my family, the golden rule, maybe not the platinum rule, but the golden rule that Andrew referenced. So he viewed it that way, and he gave these people information, good information, bad information, constantly giving them information. So it could have gone either way. The other thing he did was he ran multiple strategies. I mean, does this sound familiar when you think about recovery and the different things you're going to do? You want to think about what are all your strategies and how do I deploy them so that hopefully one of them works. He didn't wait to do one, let's try this, and then say, oh, that didn't work, let's try that. I mean, he did it all. And I think that, and I guess the other lens that was on him was you had 1 billion people watching on TV. I mean, today, that would have probably been many billions because I don't think that was really a big social media event back then. So now you had that situation that really, I think, reflected very positively on the government in Chile, and certainly you may remember the outcome that everybody got out. Everybody survived, so that was the good news. Jetblue. I like to talk, does anyone remember any issue involving Jetblue? What do you remember? What was it about? Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious whether anyone actually remembers, because I think they did such a good job with this that no one remembers. So what happened with JetBlue, I think it was in 2008, was it, or 9, they had a major ice storm, and it shut them down for like a week. No planes, everything grounded. And the CEO came right out and said, we don't know what happened. We don't know how this happened. We don't know how to fix it. But my commitment to you is we're going to figure it out. We're going to fix it. We're going to make sure that going forward, JetBlue provides the best customer service of any airline. And we're going to make amends for anyone who was impacted, and they gave away all these, benefits. And my takeaway from that is a word that I like to use when I'm working with clients who are in crisis. And that word is contrition. I think you have to show contrition. When you did something bad or wrong, it's not enough to give an apology, an empty apology. I think the reason why that went so well for him is he really kind of bared his soul on this, and he was so honest about the screw up and admitted to a human condition. I don't know how I got here. I don't know how we got here, but we're here. We're going to fix it. And I think that, when we contrast that with some of these other examples that are up here, now I'll take you back to the anger, the outrage, that concept. With Equifax, how many of you, by the way, ever checked to see were you on the list? How many hands? Yeah. So we were all impacted. I don't know how much you remember about that, but with Equifax, I think the thing that really bothered me the most was the more than coincidental timing of several of their executives had sold stock. Do you remember that? And they were charged with insider trading. Now, they will argue their defense that they were not aware. And you know what? They may not have been aware, but then shame on that company. Yeah, I'm getting this sign here. Right, shame on them for not being aware. The other thing that really was aggravating was, sure, they were going to give you a monitoring service. Whose monitoring service did they want you to use? And what did you have to do to get it for free? Anyone remember? You had to sign in, and you had to give them your social security number again, the last 4 digits. The other thing they wanted you to do was sign a waiver. What was the waiver? That you wouldn't sue them. Exactly. So how much outrage do you think people had? How angry were people, right? And how did this spread? Like it went like wildfire. Next thing you know, when you talk about context, I mean, there were congressional hearings. I mean, it got as bad as it could get. So those are the consequences that flow from the way people respond when the event is unfolding. United Airlines, I mean, that one, obviously you had the video of the passenger who was dragged off the plane. What do you remember about that one? Anybody want to throw out something they remember about what they think United did wrong? Everything. Okay, one of the things that stands out, the CEO apologized, but he apologized for the wrong thing. He apologized for like the overbooking and the scheduling that led to the fact that we needed to take people off the plane. He didn't apologize for the fact that he didn't empower any of his employees to make a decision. And I think empowerment, that was one of the words that was coming to me this morning when Andrew was talking about leadership. And I think empowerment is very, very important. We have to empower our people within, obviously, the guidelines of what we need them to do. What's the vision? What is it that we're expecting of them? But then give them some latitude to navigate some of these difficult situations. And that was clearly missing. And I would argue that that might have been an anomaly, or it may have been some sign of something in their culture. So I think that that was a problem. And of course, being a dog lover, the fact that a few weeks later they had the dog that was in the overhead that died, that didn't help either. Hawaii missile alert, does anybody remember that? You guys, I'm sure this is something that's been a case study for everyone in your profession, right? You probably could all write a white paper right now from memory on all the things that went wrong from a continuity perspective, emergency response planning perspective with the Hawaii missile event. So for those of you who don't know it, that was when the government was, the emergency management organization in Hawaii was doing a routine test. And unfortunately, using not OnSolve, I don't think, or was it? Not OnSolve or any of the companies that were then acquired. Okay, so we could say not OnSolve. They used an alert system that sent out an alert that it was a real event. It didn't say that it was a test. So if you remember, that caused all the people to panic and go into this frenzy of how do we save ourselves. You saw these videos that were parents were lifting like the drain covers and sticking their kids down into the sewer systems. And unfortunately, the real tragedy there was that they did not have the mechanism within their plans that would have enabled them to either recall the alert, and by the way, that was again cultural. They needed permission. You can't always wait for permission. People have to, again, be empowered to make decisions. So that one, I think, was a really great learning opportunity for everyone, for all of us in this business. Uber, that one and the ones that followed, I think cover up is probably delay in notification to people. How much outrage do people feel by that, right? Now, I will say in cyber, it's very common that the bad guys could be in your system a very long time before you know it, right? You guys know that. So the question really is not how long they were in your system, but when did you find out they were in your system and when did you do something? So in that case, they just really didn't handle that well. So if you apply the definitions, let's use the Hawaii example, the threat was the alert, the employee issued the alert. The vulnerability was there was no cancellation feature, no empowerment, and the event was the actual public chaos that ensued. Was there a negative reaction? Absolutely. absolutely. Were people afraid? That's a perfect example where people were really afraid, right? They were afraid, they were blaming them. I mean, it got worldwide attention. So so if you view crisis as the threat, I think you will have a different view on planning, and you won't have to use the excuse or let anyone tell you, well, we don't know what the future's gonna bring. It doesn't matter. You can get ready. You can get your teams ready. So what we know is that it comes from unknowns. Yes, absolutely, it's gonna come from unknowns, but it's also gonna come from the known unknowns. It's those things you've ignored that have been lurking in the dark corners of your organizations that no one's really wanted to face up to. Those things eventually come back to bite you. So don't be surprised. And if there's any position in a company that I think gets the window into those dark corners, it's all of you. If you're doing a BIA and you're doing your interviews and you're doing your risk assessments, I mean, am I right? Do you walk away sometimes and you say to yourselves, wow, that company's just culturally got issues. People don't talk to each other, there's silos. And that does come back to bite you when you're in a crisis environment. If you don't have the free flow of communication, or worse, if people are withholding information like they sometimes do, that is a recipe for compounding the events that occurred that led to your crisis. So you guys know there's intense scrutiny. I mean, all of you can look at this later. There's lots there. So what can we do about this? This is why I wanted my notebook, because when I wrote down, when Andrew was talking about this, becoming a leader, it was kind of interesting. I wrote down, you start with the vision. So to prepare for the crisis, any type of crisis, you need to know, what is the vision? What are we trying to protect? We're trying to protect our critical assets, right? So the next thing was leverage people's versatility. What does that mean? It means we need a multidisciplinary type of group of people to be on a crisis team. People who have different knowledge bases and skill sets that can add value as a team. So that's perfectly in line. Creating the playbooks and the plans. I guess that's what I'll call building the vigor, making sure you're ready, that you have everything lined up, your resources. You know what decisions you have to make, what are the actions, and that was the last one, the velocity, it was his term. So this really hit me that as I'm listening to it, this is exactly the same recipe for how to build an effective crisis team. And as far as like how to manage a crisis, I think, look, command and control is vital. Back to the Chilean miners, somebody had to come in and take authority. We say, we have this saying you've probably heard before, every crisis needs a general. It doesn't mean the general doesn't have the troops and his team, but every crisis needs somebody who's willing to step up and be accountable and to help the team bring forth the information that's needed so that the decisions can be made. But with that said, the other saying I really like to use that came from this Prussian general from hundreds of years ago, or I guess it's 1880, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So you all know this. You kill yourselves to write these great plans, but we all know that there could be a reason to diverge from those plans. But I'd sure like to start with a good plan. It's a lot easier to morph and adjust if you have that solid underlying foundation in your program, which I'm sure all of you do, or you wouldn't be in this room. That's the other thing I learned, that people who come here to these conferences, you would think it's the people who have no plans. Like yesterday, a gentleman made a comment in the artificial intelligence session that well, there's all these people out here who don't even have business continuity plans, these companies, so I'm sure they're not focused on AI. And I think there may be some truth to that. People who focus, companies that invest the time to put people like you in the positions you're in and send you to conferences care about their business resilience and their continuity. And I find that people like you just want to keep getting better at what you do. And to your credit. And the conversation I had with Ann is that I think there's an opportunity. I think in the last two engagements, we were involved in working with boards of directors and C-suites on putting strategic leadership programs in place for crisis management, for those types of threats that really could make the difference of whether a company survives or not. And typically, those are the threats that are reputational in nature. And each time we've advocated that they put a position called a crisis coordinator on their leadership team. It doesn't mean that person has all the knowledge about the strategy and the overarching goals of the company and what's important to the board, but what that person does have is a knowledge of process, a knowledge of how to keep people on task, because with all due respect to the executives, you could write all the plans you want. You know what happens when they come in the room and they have a real emergency, a real crisis? Do you think any of them remember they have a plan? No, because look, they didn't get there for no reason. These are people who are very confident. We have a saying sometimes, they could be often wrong but never in doubt. And sometimes you need that, because these people are not afraid to make decisions. They will make decisions. They may not always be the right decisions, but they'll make them. But it's important that somebody be in that room to say, hey, let's just take a breath. I've got a bunch of checklists here. Now, I know you guys don't do checklists, but I'm just going to go through this checklist myself to make sure that you haven't overlooked anything. So it's not like you have to announce it and say, let's go line by line. What I'm suggesting is that somebody with your skill set be part of a process that facilitates leadership when they find themselves in situations that go beyond what your typical business continuity plans address. And I think there's an opportunity for that, but I think the way you get there is you have to show that value to your companies that is beyond operational, that you can, I'm not saying you have to think on their strategic level, but you have to show how the process and skills you have will enhance what they are doing when they are in crisis. And the last thing I'm just going to throw out, because I know we're actually am I good with 3 minutes left? I want to point out the role of insurance. We started in the beginning where we talked about how insurance is putting a price tag on risk. The problem is now risk has evolved so much and the threats have changed so much, and the insurance industry is not keeping pace with coverages that respond to those threats. Are any of you in the room also responsible for purchasing insurance in your organizations? Some of you are. And do some of you either report to risk management or work with the person who does the insurance? Not many. How many of you have a regular dialogue with the person who buys insurance in your companies? How many of you don't? That's my better question. Put your hands high. I want to see this. Okay. That's insane. I mean, think about that. You're the ones planning for what could go wrong. Who's aligning that with the coverages that your company's buying? They should be in lockstep with one another. So, for example, K&R. And you don't have to raise your hand because I know you're not allowed to say if you have K&R, and if anyone ever asks you, you should never raise your hand. But kidnap and ransom coverage. I didn't know this until recently. K&R, which would pay for the extraction of your employees that might get kidnapped right in foreign countries, they would pay for the teams to come in. I didn't know that K&R policies now cover data. I don't know if yours do, if you have them, but that might be something to look at. Cyber coverage, mainstream. Everybody has cyber now. The prices have come way, way down, right? So if you don't have cyber, you should. But what does it apply to? Take a look at what we've been talking about, right? We're talking about AI. We're talking about, the next one here about, there's deadly weapon insurance now that will cover if you have an armed intruder or some type of use of a vehicle or a knife or whatever it is that could cause violence in your workplace. There are insurance policies that will actually cover those events now. But what's important to think about is how do those policies respond when you have these newer types of risks? So drones. I don't know if the policy is going to cover it if the weapon comes in on a drone. I don't know, maybe. Will cyber apply to AI? I mean, you think about, okay, we're using AI to run a freight train. The freight train goes off the tracks and it kills a lot of people and does a lot of damage. I would think a general liability policy might step in for that. But what if it was hacked? And that's what caused the train to go off the tracks and do its damage. Cyber coverage doesn't cover physical damage unless people like you have pointed out these exposures to the risk manager who buys the insurance, because those things can be negotiated. chain business, and I know that hacking, my trucks or whatever the vehicles are now so computerized that, we talk about autonomous vehicles down the road. Those things are vulnerable to hacking. So if that's an exposure, let's make sure that our insurance policies are aligned with the exposures that we see now and those that are coming down the road. And that's why going back to that, pulling people together and do the yes and exercise, if you want to call it that, or that forecasting of where we might go with risk in the future, I think is very important. It'll help you make better decisions as it relates to the coverages. So at this point, in closing, I would say, look, everyone, get out your crystal ball. I don't know what's in it. I mean, in fact, I'm less sure, I think, after coming to this conference and hearing some of the things than I was when I got here. But what I do know is, in light of that, we need to be prepared for something. And I think it's the capabilities within all of you to make the value proposition in your companies that they should spend some time on this future thinking and planning. So with that, I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here.
No question? One or two, all right. Okay, I know, real quickly. So Susie, as I stand here, one of the questions, I'll go to the top. Ways to balance transparency and mitigate speed of negative news.
Say that again.
All right, come over and read it.
I just want to make sure I understand.
Balance the transparency and mitigate speed of negative news.
Yeah. So it's easier to apologize for being late than being wrong. Does that answer the question? In other words, take a breath. One of the most important things after something bad happens is take a breath. Think about who's been impacted, what are their needs, not yours. What are the needs of the people that have been impacted? Direct your actions toward them, and the rest starts to fall in place. But that first inclination to start talking is absolutely the worst thing you could do.
Absolutely. It looks like we're creeping up on time. So Susie, I can't say thank you enough. I promised a good one. Wasn't it great? So, okay, great time. I look forward to seeing you all at the reception tonight at 6:30 and outside. Weather's going to be great this year. Last year we got pulled inside, so looking forward to it. Enjoy the conference. Susie will be with us in our booth for a couple hours before she disappears to fly home. So drop by and see us. Would love to chat. Great time.
What she said.
There you go.
So just a couple of quick notes. My takeaway from that conversation, and I know you guys are interested to get out really, really quick, but I do want to give you one takeaway. If I'm in the picture, I can't see the frame. So sometimes we have to step out of our own picture to see our frame and to be able to implement all of the tips that Susie just gave us. Enjoy your break. We'll see you back in 15 minutes.